Well, to be honest, I don't really know an exact definition of what a cultural frame of reference, but I feel like it's getting leaning towards a certain outlook. That's how I feel like it's going to. But it's talking about a person, what their culture is, what do they believe in, and just that person in general. That's how I feel like. But I really don't know the definite definition to it.
When I think of that question, I ask myself, do I really know the question or do I not? And unfortunately, I am not familiar with that question and what that term means.
I think that a cultural frame of reference is unique to every individual or every subgroup of a certain culture. I think that it pertains to um, how you see your own culture and not necessarily other cultures. So your frame is within what you know and not necessarily what you know about others.
I believe a cultural frame of reference is the perspective upon which curriculums in schools, since I am an educator, are written, sometimes from a biased perspective in how the lessons are taught, the instructional strategies used, as well as the rules, guidelines, the limitations, and parameters upon which a child or an instructor or an administrator or in which the policy at large governs itself.
I think that a cultural frame of reference means that a person looks at the world through their own lens. And so that can be dependent upon their background, how they were raised, family background, cultural differences, and things of that nature.
I feel like it affects it positively and negatively. One, from a student, from a pre-certified teacher standpoint, I feel like it can affect negatively most of the time because I am an African American male, but in my class I'm gonna have females, males, white, blacks, Hispanics. I'm gonna have a diverse group of students. I cannot teach my students based on what I believe in or based on my culture because they don't know. And in order for a child to actually have meaningful learning, meaning that when I say meaningful learning means that they can, anytime I bring up a question about what I taught, they can answer it. That's when you know a child has learned. They have to relate to something. If I'm talking about, African American culture, how can they relate to it if they're not African American? Or how can I teach from a African American perspective and I have a white student in there? They can't relate. So that's why I feel like it's not as effective to do in the educational realm. Now it is okay to do it as a kid to introduce it to students, but I wouldn't have my class centered around it.
So I think that the cultural frame of reference, if you view it in like a negative way, it could affect like a student-teacher relationship or a classroom relationship, because if you come from a place where there are different cultures or there are diverse backgrounds, the teacher may not be able to relate because she's only known one frame. So if you have kids in your class or even other staff members or faculty that are from different cultures, you can't relate necessarily because you're stuck in your own frame.
In terms of testing and assessments, summative assessments, you have ACT, you have SAT, you have PASS, you have had so many tests over the years, and it's been culturally biased in that a student that's coming from a home in high poverty, they're unable to relate to a skiing trip. And so when you write a test, although you're assessing main idea and supporting details, that student is now thrown off and challenged beyond their own mental means because they haven't had the experience and cannot imagine what it would be like to have.
I think that having a cultural frame of reference could have an effect on education through student-teacher relationships. And a negative way that it could be affected is it could affect how that teacher deals with certain situations or that one-on-one student relationship with the student who has a different background from him or herself. And positively, it could broaden the educator's perspective. And I think that's how it could have an effect on education.
You brought up an interesting point. So how do you think that teachers who may teach students of a background different from theirs, or something that they're totally not used to, reach out to those students who are different than them? Like, what are some ways that teachers can effectively teach a classroom whose students are diverse or different from them?
So I think that in order to effectively do that, the teacher must take it upon themselves to go get educated on the topic. They have to reach out to people of different backgrounds, maybe their faculty or staff, or go talk to their supervisor about ways to get acquainted with other cultures or do their research, or just anything in order to be able to reach a child or a student on that personal level, so that they can make the learning environment better for that child.
So doing this project was very interesting, and it was actually kind of fun. But the main thing that I took away from doing this assignment was, well, not even the main thing that I took away, but just with the limited amount of respondents that I did have, I found that most of my respondents had very similar answers as far as what a cultural frame of reference actually is. Um, the majority, if not all, of my respondents basically said that the cultural frame of reference is how an individual of a particular background, whether that's racial, ethnic, socioeconomic status, what have you, those backgrounds tend to view the world, or how they perceive information. Um, Generally, people did not exactly know what a cultural frame of reference was until I actually prompted them to not give an answer, but to um, at least aid them in going the right direction of answering the question. Um, a lot of the respondents brought up interesting points as far as how does having a cultural frame of reference affect education, which leads us into the issues that we find in multicultural education as discussed in class. Um, some of the respondents pointed out that it could have an effect on teacher-student relationships. So if a teacher was of another, well, is of a background that differs from his or her students, then it could possibly put a strain on the student or the students to perceive the information that is being taught in a course, or just the student having a hard time relating or just learning the material in general because they don't necessarily have that same frame of reference that the instructor has. Um, Mr. Lee also gave some interesting points that we talked about, not as far as multicultural education is concerned, but more so when we discussed race and the achievement gap, is how standardized tests could be um, culturally biased, and that also ties into multicultural education, and what or how one's frame of reference or what one's frame of reference is. Um, because he talked about those of low socioeconomic status that who may never experience a ski trip, and if you have a test such as the ACT or the SAT or any other test that asks about that, and you have a child who is of who is of a lower socioeconomic status, who has never experienced going on a ski trip, then that, not to say that it makes it harder for that student to answer that question, but they are not able to put that question into perspective. They're not able to envision that scenario and effectively answer the question.
Oh, I thought you were going to ask. I think that it affects education because, okay, I don't know how to answer that.
As possible, you have to include, it will create an environment that is inclusive and that is conducive to learning of all backgrounds, whether that's racial, ethnic, socioeconomic status. Go in the room.
So all of these plays a part in cultural relevance, and it also has a direct tie as it relates to student success rate on assessments. You can go ahead and scratch that. Thank you.